unidentified flying object.
I'm Jack Oswald, and you're listening.
This is Hudson Hammond, and you're listening to...
I'm Richard C. Hoagland, and you're listening to...
I'm Art Bell, and you're listening to Dr. J Radio Live.
We have an unidentified flying object.
Welcome back to the second hour of Dr. J Radio Live. Like I said, I'm your host, Dr. J, broadcasting from the City of Angels, or because of Halloween, City of Demons, depending on who you ask. Remember, we are internationally syndicated via Late Night in the Midlands and the terrestrial networks in the United States, as well as Deprogram Radio Network in the UK and the terrestrial stations in the UK and EU. As promised, we have another powerhouse guest in this second hour. We are going to be shifting gears. We just left the topic of parapsychology, and now we're going to be talking about some crimes that I've been very interested in for quite some time, as well as some tactics the CIA uses. So if you haven't seen the promotions for this guest, or if you haven't read his bio on my site, well, then I might as well introduce him now. We bring you author and filmmaker, Mr. John Potash. John, welcome to the show.
Thanks for having me on.
It's a pleasure. I've actually wanted you for quite some time, especially when I heard you wrote a book about Tupac. I believe the title is FBI's War on Tupac, right?
No, it's the FBI War on Tupac Shakur and Black Leaders.
And also there's other people you talk about, for instance, the Black Panthers, the FBI's Wars on the Black Panthers, and John Lennon. Am I right?
Well, in the first book I wrote, the FBI War on Tupac Shakur and Black Leaders, it's just on Tupac, MLK, Malcolm X, Panthers, Hendrix, Marley, rappers, and linked ethnic leftists. In my second book, Drugs as Weapons Against Us, the subtitle is The CIA's Murders Targeting of SDS, Panthers, Hendrix, Lennon, Cobain, Tupac, and Other Activists.
Let's start with Tupac. So the
Sure.
year was what, 1996, was it?
That he was killed, yes. He was
Okay,
fatally shot in Las Vegas.
From all the documentaries that even play with the idea that it was a conspiracy, Unsolved Mysteries was one that really grabbed me because the only witness that spoke to the Las Vegas police ended up being killed in New York. For people who are maybe a little younger or weren't as big as fans as I was at the time, because I was born and raised in Los Angeles, so Tupac was a pretty big deal for us, considering, you have Long Beach Crips and all the fellow people. One of the schools that I attended, Ice Cube and Dr. Dre attended. So these guys were a very big deal, Death Row Records. So leading up to his death, can you tell the people what the politics were within Death Row and the case surrounding his death? For instance, that what happened that night leading up to it. And there's one thing that I'm sort of leading up to, and I'm going to let you tell the story because I know you're going to touch on this aspect.
Sure. Well, first thing I just want to ask you, I don't know if this is live by image or if it's just audio.
Audio.
Audio. Okay, no problem. So, Death Row Records was a very shady organization, and it was a very corrupt organization. And so this was found out by Detective Russell Poole when he investigated the death of Biggie Smalls, which was 6 months after Tupac's death. He found that dozens of his fellow police officers were at all levels of Death Row Records, and he asked his supervisors, "What do you make of that?" And he says, "Well, you can call these other police officers in Death Row Records troubleshooters or covert agents." So my accumulated research showed that what Death Row Records really was a U.S. intelligence front company. And their work was, their agenda was to traffic drugs, traffic guns, and basically squash the agenda of Tupac Shakur, which was an activist agenda, which had already helped gain peace truces between the Bloods and Crips gangs in different parts of Los Angeles, and then different parts of California, and then nationwide. And he did this with his Black Panther extended family and other activists who helped it happen nationwide. And so that was the purpose of Death Row Records. And they also, their other purpose was to aid in the murder of Tupac Shakur. So this is what was going on. This was the politics of Death Row Records. Now, this was, you can argue, assassination attempt of Tupac number either 6 or 7. The first one was in Oakland when Tupac came out with his first major label record. He, with the release of his worldwide release of his MTV video Trapped, within several days of that release, police stopped him, allegedly for jaywalking, and then proceeded to smash his head against the curb and choke him unconscious. And I showed 2 other incidents where people died in police custody, with those behaviors. And so there was another incident where there was a drive-by shooting on his limo coming from his premiere of the film Juice. And then a third incident in Marin City where I show all the evidence of how strangers punched Tupac for no reason when he was an honorary guest at the Marin City Fest in Marin City, just in the San Francisco Bay Area. And then police watched as they shot at him for no reason, and he escaped and ran away and was lucky to escape with his life. So there was three of the first 3 attempts on his life. And after that, you had the incident where, allegedly off-duty police officers took a gun that they had stolen from an evidence locker, and there were 2 brothers in Atlanta. And so after an Atlanta concert of Tupac's, they start beating a black guy right in front of Tupac's, car. Tupac rolls down his window, according to eyewitnesses, and asks, "What's going on?" They run over to Tupac's car and, according to eyewitnesses, smash the window of his car, shoot at him. He rolls out the back and gets a guard's gun from behind him. And when they all came out of their cars to protect him, and he shot back in self-defense. And that's why he shot a white police officer, and it was never taken all the way through court, and he got off completely. And the reason, all the evidence points to the fact that it was because it was botched assassination attempt. You can argue either number 3 or number 4. And then there was a setup with the sexual assault crime scene where it was really him, he had consensual sex with this woman, and the jury ended up finding that it was consensual sex, but he was only found guilty of touching the woman's butt against her will after consensual sex. He was found not guilty of forced sodomy, assisting forced sodomy, or any other major charges. Only touching her butt after what they considered, after both parties admitted there was consensual oral sex. There was oral sex took place. So after that, of course, there was the New York studio shooting where
Sean Puffy Combs, this New York?
Yeah, now Sean Puffy Combs was upstairs with Biggie where they were doing a recording. But I really didn't find any evidence that Sean Puffy Combs or Biggie had any part in this at all. They just happened to be upstairs. Tupac was downstairs coming in. A guy named James Henchman Rosemont actually lured him to that studio, saying, "I'll give you $7,000 cash just to rap 1 or 2 lines on somebody's CD." He needed the money at that time because there were so many times they tried to take him to trial, and I trumped up charges and trumped up lawsuits, and it was draining a lot of his money that he was giving to his Black Panther extended family, and so he ends up taking the offer. Comes into the recording studio lobby, and 2 guys end up shooting him once, get him on the ground, and then shoot him twice in the back of the head. And I have the doctor's affidavit that was presented in court that said they saw 2 bullet holes in the back of his skull, and they come out the front of his skull, and they just barely missed his brain. So this was obviously an assassination attempt. This was not a random mugging in Times Square at 11 p.m., which is the brightest place on earth, you could argue, to hold a mugging at night. And so they had these gunmen on the security camera. They had the video, and the security guard offered it to the police later, and the police turned down the videotape and closed the case. So that's just some of the police foul play around that assassination attempt. So this is some of what went on before he was even shot in Las Vegas. And then, of course, the top eyewitness in the Las Vegas shooting, Yafu Fula, who was the son of the Bronx Black Panther leader Sekou Odinga and Yasmin Fula, who was Tupac's close advisor and head of Tupac's new record label he was starting, Euthanasia Records. He witnessed the shooting. He said he told the police he thought he could ID the shooter, according to Las Vegas Sun reporter Kathy Scott. And then he's executed in New Jersey the night of the next Mike Tyson fight. And that's surely no coincidence. That's what you call anniversary timing tactic to scare people from anyone else from coming forward. And the police report about Yafu Fulu's shooting was that this was a professional hit. So, and he had no record whatsoever. He had no crime record at all. He was 19 years old and could have been a rising star himself. But so that's a bit of what went on, around the shooting of Tupac Shakur, which Tupac's bodyguard, Kevin Hackey, was also being paid by the FBI at this time while working for Los Angeles Police Department. He actually turned on the FBI and tried to get Tupac not to go to Vegas, kind of in a warning. And after that, so Suge Knight and Dave Kenner fired him immediately upon hearing that. And so he says he had the documents to prove, and he said this on Nick Broomfield's film Biggie and Tupac, which was a major, film release, major theatrical release back in 2002, I think it was. But he said that he had the documents to prove that the FBI and ATF watched Tupac's shooting in the motorcade. Kathy Scott, Las Vegas crime reporter Kathy Scott, she works for the Las Vegas Sun, also said in her book that it was well known that the FBI had watched Tupac's shooting. So that's
in Vegas, there's obviously a few conspiracy theories. For instance, the mainstream media has been saying that he got in a fight leaving the boxing match. He fought a Crip, and therefore because he's associated with the Bloods. For instance, Suge Knight was always wearing red, and so his affiliation with the Bloods, and that's what set off the chain of events which caused him to be shot from that white Cadillac. But then you have other factors to consider, like why of all nights was he not wearing his body vest? Right. And then comes the other conspiracy that because of money and possibly because Tupac was about to leave, Suge Knight actually staged it. And when I asked people about that, I said, do you really think that Suge Knight would have been in a position to get shot? And he said, if there's a real shooter, somebody who really knows how to shoot, he will know how to hit the mark and graze somebody or shoot them in somewhere non-fatally to make it look like you two are victims. So that's two conspiracies and what the mainstream media tells us. First of all, let's dissect first the body vest. Do you know why he was told or why he didn't wear it, the body vest, in that night?
Well, to the best of my knowledge, he was wearing the bulletproof vest until he was in the Vegas heat, and it was just too hot to keep wearing it. But the more strange factor is the fact that they broke normal procedure by not having the bodyguards in the car with Tupac and Suge. And they ordered the bodyguards to not have guns on them. And they also took the battery out of the cell phone of his bodyguard, Frank Alexander. So they were unarmed bodyguards, not in the car as they usually are, with a cell phone that didn't work. And so that's just some of the irregularities. And so, yeah, I just showed the evidence that Suge Knight was involved, but he was low man on the totem pole, low man on the U.S. intelligence totem pole. So he didn't have the full picture of what was going on. He didn't know how things were going to go down. But for gunmen to be so precise that they hit, 13 bullets coming at Tupac from, and Tupac's in between the gunman and Suge Knight. And Suge Knight, arguably, the best argument and the best evidence I've heard is that he wasn't hit directly at all with the bullet. That he got grazed by flying shrapnel, either from the broken glass, or from shrapnel, the ricocheting, bullets. And that was it. He was fine. You saw him walking around the hospital the next day without a scar to be seen. So, all these people saying there was blood gushing from him, I think they're lying, really. But even if they're telling the truth, it's just obvious he wasn't hurt badly at all, and Tupac was fatally shot. So for a guy twice the size of Tupac to not get hurt, virtually at all, compared to Tupac getting fatally shot. It's obvious that Tupac was the main target, and the gunmen were very careful not to kill Suge Knight. And that's just, but that's the evidence against Suge Knight is that he knew Las Vegas. He went to college in Las Vegas. It's not a big town. He owned a club, was it 666 or 662, whatever it's called, that they were going to. He owned that club that they were going to play at. And so he knew there was a hospital straight down. If he would have kept going straight, he could have gone right to the hospital. But he does a U-turn, goes over a median to do a U-turn to go back the way he came, where he knew he would have gotten clogged up, and which he did. And, and that was that. And he just, it took much longer to get Tupac to the hospital because of that. And that's, he was part of the setup. Now, there's a bunch more evidence to point to how he was part of the setup. But, obviously he was low man on the totem pole to have his life even put in any sort of jeopardy for the bullets coming, that way.
Let me ask you this about Suge Knight now. He's been convicted, I believe it's 25 years, correct me if I'm wrong, for his recent murder or the driving over someone during the production of I don't want to say it's the movie about Eazy-E, Boys in the Hood, about NWA. So I believe he's recently been convicted of 25 years. Either he pled guilty or something like that. Do you recall what the sentence was?
Yeah, I'm sorry that I came out with my book in 2007 and my film one, my book based in 2009. And I just have not kept up with every single thing that's happened to Suge Knight. I know he was put in jail for something, for running over people, and he got a lot of jail time. I just don't know how much. And so my argument is that they sacrificed him after he accomplished the task of aiding in the murder of Tupac.
Here's my question. Now that he's serving so much time, what are the intelligence agencies or the FBI specifically and the people that were his handlers, are they worried at all that he's going to sing or turn state's evidence or tell that story so he can sort of try to get out of his sentence, which I don't see how that's possible because that's a whole new crime not linked to what happened with Tupac, or to try to clear his name in some sort of way? Are they worried at all in your mind?
I don't know. I would guess they are, but I'm just not sure. I would guess they would be worried about him giving some kind of testimony that would give away some facts that would aid in the truth coming out.
You talked about other black leaders that the FBI has been targeting. And from my understanding, this goes back to J. Edgar Hoover. Is that what your evidence has found?
Yeah, sure. Going back to J. Edgar Hoover, yeah.
Why do you think he wanted people like Martin Luther King Jr. killed, or Jimi Hendrix, Bob Marley?
Well, the oligarchs that run this country are notoriously racist and murderous. Genocidally murderous. Going back to this eugenics movement in the early 1900s, which passed laws in over half the states in this regard. But they're incredibly racist, incredibly prejudiced against most minorities that aren't white Anglo-Saxon Protestant, and have waged wars and killed millions, in other countries of people of color or people whose resources they want to take over. And so when you got these Black Panthers, for example, who are, diehard activists trying to do right by their community, but also really setting a role modeling for other minority communities to do the best for the, common man, in their communities, that's really against their agenda, their racist, hyper-capitalist agenda and pro-war agenda. Black Panthers were anti-war. And that's why they were targeted for their civil rights work and their anti-war work. And MLK was he was assassinated exactly 1 year after he made his anti-war pronouncement, anti-Vietnam War pronouncement at Riverside Church. And exactly 1 year later, he was assassinated. And one of his top investigators, a friend of his who was a lawyer who teaches at Oxford University, William Pepper.
Yeah, I've interviewed William Pepper. Yeah, Sir Hans attorney.
Yeah, he's a great investigator, great writer. He said that it's no coincidence that Martin Luther King was killed exactly 1 year later from that pronouncement against the Vietnam War. And so, that just shows what that was about. It was partly because of his anti-war stance is why he was killed, and partly because of his great, civil rights work and great economic, and human rights work.
Now I'm going to switch gears now, and we're still staying with the FBI, but you also wrote about John Lennon being targeted by them. If they're racist, why would they target a white Brit?
Because they're so pro-war and hyper-capitalist, and John Lennon was extremely anti-war and
peaceful,
pro-Black Panthers, and called himself a socialist. And so that's antithetical. That's the exact opposite of hyper-capitalism, is the socialism. And so, and John Lennon invited Bobby Seale, one of the two founders of the Black Panthers, and nationally went to the Merv Griffin show, and I think he was a guest. He was like a guest host for a week on the Merv Griffin show, and was allowed to invite any guests he wanted on there. And he invited a bunch of activists on there, including Bobby Seale. So John Lennon was considered a threat, partly for that reason. Now, before John Lennon turned so extremely activist and anti-war and pro-civil rights, he was somewhat, he was against the war for sure. And he was just like a budding activist, but I argue that they manipulated him to promote LSD and other drugs, and they dosed his coffee. Somebody dosed his coffee. A dentist, actually, George Harrison's dentist in 1965, dosed his coffee with LSD along with the coffee of George Harrison. They didn't know that they were getting acid in their coffee. So
this is the era when LSD was legal, by the way, right?
This was when LSD was legal. But in Britain, they didn't even know what it was. Like George Harrison said he didn't even know what it was. John Lennon knew what it was, but George Harrison said, "What's LSD?" He'd never heard of it before. And so at that time, it was like an assault on their minds. But before that, the guy who was deputy director of a program called MKULTRA, Project MKULTRA, went over to London with loads of LSD, loads of money, and loads of agents, and told the agents to put LSD in as many musicians' hands as possible. So this was no coincidence that this happened after that. And this guy, Robert Lashbrook, who was deputy director of MKUltra, was very sinister in doing that, and was obviously to get musicians to inadvertently promote LSD. And why? And the obvious reason was to hurt the minds of young people, particularly anti-war activists and civil rights activists. And it was really going on in a huge way in the United States. And it was found that and this came out in A.E. Hotchner's book. A.E. Hotchner was a longtime editor of Ernest Hemingway, and he wrote about this in his book Blown Away, an oral history of the Rolling Stones. And so, he found that the Daily Mail newspaper really came out with the fact that a guy named Schneiderman was an undercover agent and called himself the Acid King, but he got himself friends with the Rolling Stones guitarist, whose name was Keith Richards, and got Mick Jagger to trip for the first time in 1968 or 67, I think it was. He was a holdout, Mick Jagger, for tripping, and he finally convinced Jagger to trip for the first time. He gave him the LSD, and he turned out to be, an undercover agent. Daily Mail said he was an undercover agent for both the FBI and MI5, which is the British version of the FBI. And that was obviously an extension of the MKUltra work, because FBI and police intelligence do MKUltra's CIA's, bidding too. And so that's some of the evidence of that program.
You've dug in deep to MKUltra, I clearly see. So you've probably seen the links of the precursor to MKUltra. There was a Harvard professor that the CIA, I don't know if the NSA was involved, but definitely the CIA would pay to do some psychological work on his students. And one of them ended up being Theodore Kaczynski. Have you come across that evidence?
That's pretty well known. So let me go backtrack and tell you the history of MKUltra. So MKUltra had different names, but leading up to 1953, they decided to put all these different projects under the rubric, the umbrella of MKUltra, Project MKUltra. So MKUltra had about 150 different sub-projects. And MKUltra, some of the literature said was, some of the sub-projects said was the use of drugs in unconventional warfare. And LSD was the drug they used the most, but they used about 2 or 3 dozen different drugs in this unconventional warfare, first testing these 2 or 3 dozen different drugs on Edgewood Arsenal soldiers, over 1,000 Edgewood Arsenal soldiers, 1,000 or more soldiers from in other areas. And they knew what these drugs, by doing all this testing in the 1950s, the early 1960s, and into actually 1970, they knew what these drugs would do to people, and they did surveys afterwards, and at least 24% of these people, 19 years later, said they still suffered long-lasting negative effects from LSD. So they knew what it was, doing that was damaging people, and so they then, use these drugs. And the warfare they talk about, you think of warfare, you think of foreign lands and some kind of, standard war. But all the evidence points to the fact that warfare was actually much more targeting people in the United States who were activists on behalf of civil rights and anti-war work, and that's what I show in my book, Drugs as Weapons Against Us. And SDS were the largest anti-war group in the country. Students for Democratic Society was their full name. And, of course, the Black Panthers did great civil rights work and anti-war work, too. And I showed the evidence that Hendrix had turned into an activist in the last year or two of his life. And, of course, I talked about Lennon, and Kurt Cobain was actually much more of an activist than people realize, as well as Tupac Shakur, who was one-time leader of the New African Panthers at the ages of 17, 18 years old, and then stayed a diehard activist with his, peace truces between the Bloods and Crips and all.
I would think John Lennon's song Imagine really pissed them off, because that just talks about, no war and all this peace. I'm going to dive into 2 people you just mentioned. First, Jimi Hendrix. Isn't the stated supposed death heroin overdose?
Yeah, that's what they made it out to be. And his leading biographers, a guy named Cesar and Glebic, their book Electric Gypsy, showed they really did an amazing, really thorough job on Jimi Hendrix's life and death. And they showed the fact that Jimi Hendrix was not a heroin addict. He was not, he might have tried it once in his life and didn't like it. He was weaning off of drugs at the end of his life. And Hendrix's fiancée, Monica Danneman, published a book showing that all the activist projects he had taken on in the last year or two of his life. And they also point to the fact that he had been quoted that you got to support your Black Panthers to get things done, to fight these evil people at the top. And so originally Hendrix wasn't supporting the Black Panthers, but after Martin Luther King's assassination, he became very depressed and started doing that, to dedicate his last album to the Black Panthers. And he was asking Bob Dylan to join him in a new anti-war group. And he was actually asked by Brian Jones of the Rolling Stones to form a new supergroup with him and John Lennon. And they were really considering, doing that with their good friend Brian Jones before Brian Jones was murdered, drowned in his own swimming pool, according to eyewitnesses in A.E. Hotchner's book about the Rolling Stones. And Brian Jones with Mick Jagger were the leading anti-war, activists in the Rolling Stones. So that's some of what was going on. And so Jimi Hendrix in his last hours, the best evidence is that he was really killed. And his manager was supposedly former MI6. MI6 is the British CIA. And all evidence shows that he stayed an undercover agent for MI6, and his job was to manipulate and then murder Jimi Hendrix. And there are 2 people that said that Mike Jeffrey, who was the manager of Jimi Hendrix, admitted to them, that he actually had Jimi Hendrix murdered. And he was drunk at the time, and he said to 2 different people at 2 different times, and I quote them in their book. One of them was a roadie named Tapper, who came out with this book several years ago. Another was a producer, was a musical producer, and I have that in my film about I forget his name off the top of my head. So it's like, there's loads of evidence that he was actually murdered and did not, die of some kind of heroin-related accident.
Before I jump to the next name, I'm going to ask you about the Black Panthers. Now we have Black Lives Matter. Do you see any correlation from the Black Panthers and Black Lives Matter? And second part of this question is, do you see that the FBI or other agencies or other actors in the U.S. government are doing whatever it's going to take to shut them down the way they've killed these other people in the Black Panther Party?
Well, I don't know for sure. And I think the Black Lives Matter is a much more tame version of the Black Panthers. The Black Panthers, though, I studied community organizing in grad school, and the Black Panthers, lots of activists consider the Black Panthers the best community organizers that maybe this country's ever seen. The Young Lords was the Latino version of the Black Panthers, and they modeled themselves after the Black Panthers in their programs. The American Indian movement said the same thing, that they modeled themselves after the Black Panthers and their community programs. And so, they use guns just for self-defense and police brutality situations, which were even much more rampant then than they are now, though they are so rampant now too. So I think Black Lives Matter is a good activist group. I don't know if they're going to be targeted in the same way the Black Panthers were, but there does seem to be some targeting of them from the little I've heard about it. So I don't know what's going to come next, though, regarding that.
Because the Black Panthers, all these people were killed, leaders that were killed, people that were looked up to killed. Do you think that's why this generation has not seen the resurgence of the Black Panthers? You think that out of fear is sort of why they stopped doing what they were doing?
I'm sure that's some of it. I can imagine. And who can blame them? It's very dangerous to take up arms in self-defense against police brutality, because they kill people unarmed, left and right. So if you're armed, it seems like, it could be more instantaneous in a suicide. When they see you carrying a gun, they're going to shoot you immediately. So it's very scary for Black activists these days, white activists too, but definitely Black activists. It's much scarier. It's incredible how much restraint that police officers use for white activists with guns compared to Black activists.
You made a very good point. All these unarmed Black people are being killed, and if they're armed, I could imagine the crosshairs being on them that much quicker, because then the cops can justify, well, he was armed, he would have shot, or she would have shot, so let's just kill him first.
Right, no doubt.
The other name I wanted to talk about is Kurt Cobain. People talked about the suicide note not necessarily being in his writing. I know some arguments said that he was so doped up that he couldn't have done it, which I don't see that's possible, because anybody who's been using heroin or something like that for that long would probably know what they're able to handle as they're whatever they're doing, especially if he was constantly using this drug when he was writing songs or singing. Why do you think first of all, let's talk about his death. For those people who are in the younger generation where his music wasn't as much of a big impact to me and to you, tell people what happened, the circumstances around his death. The mainstream story.
Well, the mainstream story is that they say he was suicidal, and he apparently shot a lot of heroin and then proceeded to use a shotgun to shoot himself, in the mouth. And but let me just quote, for example, Dr. Cyril Wecht. He's over 80 years old. He was president of the American Forensic Pathologists Association. He's considered one of the top coroner in the country, top expert in the world. Some consider him. He was featured in that film Concussion, about football players and concussions. He's been on every major news program, and still is on every major news program. And he said in the film Soaked in Bleach that he's not seen a case in his entire career where someone proceeds to shoot up a large amount of heroin and then shoot themselves. It just does. Kurt Cobain's death just does not make any sense, he says. And then on another news program, in a local news program, he says that he believes that Kurt Cobain's suicide was faked. He was really murdered, and it was made to look like a suicide. All right, and he was given loads of evidence to come up with this conclusion, and I have that in my new film, Drugs as Weapons Against Us, the CIA War on Musicians and Activists, which is going to be released video on demand January 29th. It's going through film festivals right now, though. It's won Best Documentary at a few film festivals. But so that's just some of the evidence. There's a massive amount of evidence supporting what he's saying. There's another, they said they never developed the crime scene photos until 20 some years later. At the 1994, when the death took place of Kurt Cobain, there's pictures that, experts say can show you where's fingerprints of blood prints and different other, where's the different aspects of the scene through the photographs can help be studied and explain whether it was a suicide or a murder. So the best evidence that I've seen in some real good books by award-winning writers, Ian Halperin and Max Wallace, show that what happened was that somebody put Valium or some other benzodiazepine in his drink, Kurt Cobain's drink. They had him, virtually passed out, and then several people, while he was, just barely awake at all from all the benzos in his drink, held him down to shoot him up, and with tons of heroin. At that point, he would be close to death or just about dead, and quickly put a shotgun, use a shotgun to shoot him. And that's the scenario that all the evidence supports. Now, the police, some police whistleblowers say that their police chief told them this was not to be investigated as anything but a suicide. Any homicide investigation was just for show. And so they basically announced the suicide, very quickly, extremely quickly, before they got back loads of results and all that. And then they proceed to give the shotgun to Courtney Love to be melted down and allow Courtney Love to completely destroy the crime scene by, destroying the greenhouse. And so it's pretty amazing what happened in that whole situation and all the police foul play. Now, Courtney Love, when Kurt Cobain was forced, he was kind of like forced to go into a rehab. He really, best evidence shows that he was not a heroin addict at that time. There was a blood test done on him when he accidentally overdosed in Rome, and that accidental overdose appears to be, it was with Courtney Love's medication that it appears she put in his drink without him knowing it, and caused that accidental, overdose. So when the Rome took his blood and tested what was in his blood, they found no illicit substances except for Courtney Love's medication. Now, if he was an active heroin addict, he would have had to have heroin in his system every single day, and it would have come up. It's detectable within 3 or 4 days of use. So he obviously wasn't a heroin addict anymore. So they're forcing him into rehab was just for show. They were manipulated by Courtney or whoever else to force him into rehab. He was already canceling his Lollapalooza gig, which was going to lose a lot of people a lot of money. So they had a lot to lose by not pushing him to do what they wanted. And so he just walks out of rehab because they're not locked down. Rehabs aren't locked down. That's not the way it works.
Voluntary, yeah.
Yeah, they're voluntary. So he leaves rehab on his own, and people even doctors in the rehab say he didn't look anywhere near suicidal. He was very happy with seeing his kid and all that when he was in rehab. He leaves though, and comes back to his house, and of course that's when he's murdered. But while in between that time, there was several days in between him leaving rehab and going back to his house. And so Courtney Love hires a private detective, a guy named Tom Grant. That private detective Grant used to work for the Los Angeles Police Department. And he starts investigating things and finds that a load of evidence that Courtney Love played a part in helping murder Kurt Cobain. And so he came out with this in a manual and a book, and he said Kurt Cobain's credit card was used, that was in his wallet, was used several days after his death. And he found that he showed the evidence of that, the copies of the records of his credit card. He showed tons of evidence that this was a murder and not a suicide. So that's just some of the evidence about Kurt Cobain. But even a guy named Eldon Alduce Hoke, said in Nick Broomfield's film, Kurt and Courtney, that Courtney Love actually offered him $50,000 to kill Kurt Cobain, and he passed a polygraph, about that happening. And in the film, he says, and I didn't think she was serious. So I missed the chance to get that money, but I know who did take that offer. And he starts saying Alan, a friend of mine, Alan. And he before he says the rest of the last name, he says, well, let the FBI catch him. And 3 days after that filming of him saying that, he winds up dead. And the last person seen with him was this Alan Wrench. So it's that's just some of the loads of evidence of what was going on, and I believe I show the evidence that I get an audio recording of Courtney Love's father saying that he incidentally introduced a guy who befriended him in Ireland to his daughter Courtney Love when she had just turned 17 years old and was visiting, and she was an estranged daughter of his because Courtney Love's real mother and her grandparents had paid off a lawyer when Courtney Love was about 5 years old to get full custody of Courtney Love from her father, Hank Harrison. And Hank Harrison went to depression, but Courtney Love then wrote a letter to her father that saying, I'm in a juvenile detention center, and for the past 5 or 10 years, my counselors have been having sex with me and giving me all these different psychoactive drugs. She names all these different psychoactive drugs, and those were things that were part of a sub-project of MKULTRA, what they would do to women, and I quote those women in my book that had experienced that, and they mess women's minds up through torture and sex and drugs, and it caused a dissociative disorder, and then use them as CIA operatives to do their bidding. And 2 women testified that in a presidential hearing that the Clinton administration held on such experiments. And they testified to that with their therapists, who said that 40 other therapists had called her just before she was going to testify with her patients, saying, I have patients just like this who experience the same thing. So please tell the commission that. And so Courtney Love appeared to be, groomed for this kind of work, but groomed, as I say, tortured, really, sexually abused, given different MKUltra drugs to mess her mind up. And then, so at 17 years old, Hank Harrison has this guy named Stephen O'Leary befriend him. And turns out, so he proceeds to take Courtney Love from Ireland to England, to London, where Courtney Love's carrying 1,000 hits of acid. And at 17 years old, she spreads acid around to these music scenes like candy, and gets all these different musicians tripping. And those are the same as as you remember, I talked about, those were MKUltra activities. And she breaks up different bands. She claims to lose her virginity to a bunch of different musicians there. That and she proceeds to do that same kind of act in that same way in music scenes in Portland, in Los Angeles, in Seattle. And she appears to be doing the same things that these MKUltra agents in the 1960s were doing. And so that's some of the evidence against her, and how so I meant to say, Stephen O'Leary, on his deathbed, he died early of cancer. He wrote a letter to Hank Harrison. Hank Harrison, in his book, said he has the letter, and he published the contents of the letter in his book, Love and Death, saying that he thinks his daughter was conspired to murder Kurt Cobain. He quoted that letter, and that in that letter, Stephen O'Leary says he was working for the CIA all that time. And he said, his brother was Kevin O'Leary, who he says was also working, that Hank Harrison said he believes also was working for the CIA. And so Kevin O'Leary, apparently, I don't know if it's the same Kevin O'Leary as is in that Shark Tank show, but
yeah, Mr. Wonderful.
Yeah, but it is awfully strange that when the press said, "What are these 2 people doing together?" Kevin O'Leary and Courtney Love in the last few years, and apparently they're good friends. So
You actually answered the question I was going to have. Was Courtney Love involved? And clearly you're showing a lot of evidence of that being the case. The other question would be, why Kurt Cobain? What sort of impact was he having on the people that they wanted him to be killed? I mean, he wasn't a Black Panther. What do you think it was?
Well, Kurt Cobain had similar politics as Tupac Shakur. They were both very anti-capitalist. I've got lots of quotes in my book from Kurt Cobain about his left-wing agenda, and he kind of was somewhere between anarchist and socialist in his politics. And there's a big quote in a major publication when Kurt Cobain, actually the first one to come out before he died. And in big letters, he says he had originally wanted to put all kinds of anarchist essays on the cover of Nevermind about how to build your own bomb and things like that. But he decided he'd have to wait till he's more famous, so when people will take him more seriously about that. And so he also had pictures in utero. He had pictures of the Los Angeles Police Department burned from the LA riots in 1991. He was basically glorifying the LA riots, against police brutality. And so he had a lot of really radical left-wing, ideas and opinions and statements in support of all kinds of things that are very antithetical to the, hyper-capitalist right-wing oligarchs. And so and him being, arguably the most popular guy in the world at that time before his death, he influenced a whole lot of young people to agree with him on these kinds of political ideas.
Two more questions in line with in general of what we're talking about. Is MKUltra a program still being used by the CIA, or as I like to say, clowns in America?
Well, I showed the evidence that yes, it is still being used, and I show that in a few like the last chapters of my book. There's loads of evidence that it is, with the heavy duty promotion of ecstasy and LSD by parallel groups in the 1960s. In the 1960s, and with Timothy Leary and all that, it was a group called the Human Ecology Fund, which was shown to be a CIA front company. In the 2000s, and these days, it's the Multidisciplinary Association of Psychedelic Studies, or MAPS, or another group called the Hefter Institute, that run conferences together and give millions of dollars to fund LSD and ecstasy promoting studies all over the world. And sadly enough, even in at Harvard and Johns Hopkins, etc., they're doing this. And some of these people, some of these professors have found to have connections to to kind of the whole MKUltra program from way back when. The guy who founded MAPS talked about his support from MKUltra figures, from Human Ecology Fund figures and all.
What's the most recent targeted murder you have that is for the same political reasons?
The most recent, I just don't know if Jam Master Jay was a political murderer. He was called a political activist at the end of his life. He may have been. It's hard to say. It's just hard to know about the people that came after I was done my research, because I just have to move on to the next project each time I do what I do. And so I can't remember what the most recent was off the top of my head, except for maybe I do talk about in my first book, Jam Master Jay, and my second book. In terms of political murder, I'm sorry, I can't remember.
That's okay. Let's now, since we're winding down and we're going to go a little bit extra since we got you a few minutes late, let's talk about some current projects you're working on right now. What can people expect next from you? I know you mentioned the film coming in January 29th, which we'll talk about in a second, but what cases are you working on, or any book that you're working on about to come out?
Well, I'm just working on a political novel now, really, but the film, it's just a lot of work promoting the film. But I did a film based on my first book, which was a kind of lower level film that's available on Amazon, the FBI War on Tupac Shakur and Black Leaders DVD. But the second film is a lot more work with the film festivals going on. There's one happening in Oklahoma, for example, and a week from now. I just came from one in Chicago a week or two ago, and actually did a little benefit out there in Chicago for Fred Hampton Jr. and his group, the Black Panther Cubs. So there's a lot of work around that right now. And then the next project is the political novel. You did mention right now this film has won a few documentaries, or best documentary. Which film festivals did it win in? The one was called the Toronto International Nollywood Film Festival, and the other was called the International Indie Gathering, and other ones. One was one called the CKF Festival. Another, I'd have to look up the names of all these things. Hold on one second. But it's it's not that. I can't say it's so. Well, still, the fact that you won Best Documentary in more than one festival, clearly a lot of people, when it comes out, are going to want to see it. Every time I see a documentary, despite me not knowing what it's about, if I see that it's been winning over and over in the same category, well, then generally that's what I end up seeing, especially since it's a documentary, and that's usually what I prefer to watch over fiction. Yeah, thanks. Yeah, also, I won something in the Best Documentary and Aphrodite Film Awards, runner-up for documentary at the Next Level International Film Festival in Sydney, Australia. So different festivals like that, yeah. Let's talk. I'm assuming you have a website. Let's talk about where people can buy your books and other things like that. Sure. They can buy my books at www.drugsasweapons.com. And you can get the FBI War on Tupac book, the Drugs as Weapons book, and the DVD for the FBI War on Tupac. And so, after the 29th, hopefully my second film will be available there too. But it's also going to be coming on Vudu, Vimeo, Amazon Prime, I was told, and at least two other platforms, January 29th. And hopefully more than that. Yeah. Well, I do hope when that comes around that we can bring you back for a full 2-hour show, because as you could tell, we went a little over and there's still a lot of things I could ask of you. Again, I do want to thank you, Mr. Potash, and please stick around for After Air real quick. Everybody out there listening, remember you are able to listen via Late Night in the Midlands or Deprogrammed or the local terrestrial stations. And we're also streaming on YouTube. So there's 3 avenues for you to listen if you're listening on air. Join us tomorrow, Halloween night, another 2-hour, 2-guest show. The first hour being Dr. Barry Taff, and you'll have to check the site for the other guest because I'm going to sort of leave it up for you guys to see the promotion for it. Remember, folks, the only thing you have to remember when it comes to the show is the name of it, Dr. J Radio Live. That is DRJ Radio Live. For instance, the website, drjradiolive.com. Every single social media outlet you can think of, Minds, Patreon, Facebook, Instagram, Twitter, Flickr, Tumblr, YouTube, Google+, whatever you can think of, it's all the same username, at DRJ Radio Live. So I make it very simple for everybody to find things. I also want to thank Katie and Daryl Neely and Michael Varr of Late Night in the Midlands. Katie and Daryl do a fantastic job both running this network and also being very hands-on as audio engineers. And I would not be here if it wasn't for them. So I have to definitely thank them for their extra work that they do for running such a great network. And of course, in the United Kingdom, I want to thank JC, also known as John, who runs Deprogrammed, and for syndicating us in the European and the United Kingdom theaters. And of course, for all you YouTube listeners out there, I want to thank, of course, Adam, also known as Adderike Studios, for being my #1 moderator and always being there from the beginning to the end, and also for calling in that first hour. I would have taken calls the second hour, but there was just too many questions, and I promise this guest will be back. With that being said, folks, I wish you all have a good night. Join us back again tomorrow night on Halloween night for some special programming. And I am officially now signing off.